welcome to our Culture Revolution presentation based on the literacy campaign in Cuba. Our presentation is mainly based on Richard Jolly's literacy campaign and adult education document from 1964. So to start off with, I'm going to pass you over to Jesse.
So firstly, I'm going to speak to you about why the campaign was needed. So firstly, there was uneven and varied literacy rates across Latin America in the 1950s, of which Cuba's was 76%. Although this was perceived as one of the highest, it still wasn't high enough due to the technological advances in sectors which was too high for the level of intellect of the population. This therefore meant that under half of the population were eligible for the jobs. Secondly, education favoured the elite and also the church of which was a colonial system, which made justification of a classist and discriminatory education system. On top of this, 50% of children were in school and less than half of the adults had ever received any education, which affected the workers available for essential state jobs. These uneducated people were victims of poverty and social isolation, eradicated by providing them with resources to enter into skilled labour. So on the 6th of June 1961, there was a law passed for free and national schooling systems, which favoured families in poverty, as previously the cost of education made it inaccessible to them. So there were three parts of this law, which states that the state was responsible for the administration of education. It also states that education shall be provided as a right to all citizens. So as I stated before, it was only available to the church and also the people who are of an elite status. Additionally, learning orientated towards an educational system that responds to the cultural, technical and social needs of the country. So this mainly covered the industries of agriculture and industry that were progressing in the country. So how did the campaign take place? So over 250,000 teachers and students formed a teaching force, aided by 3 million books and 100,000 paraffin lamps. And they spent 2 weeks training in Verdadero, and the paraffin lamps were used to signify revolution. Schools and universities were also closed from April to December to permit the students to be able to take the time and learn the skills that they needed. There was also a group of people called the alphabetizadores, and they were spread in cultural Cuba and lived in communities where they taught the uneducated people who were in rural areas, as they previously didn't have any access to education. There were twice as many illiterates in the rural areas than in urban, although the rural area was only 2/3 of the size of the urban. Now I'm going to pass you over to Andre, who's going to speak about who the instructors were.
Okay, the instructors were made up of a group called Brigadistas and Alphabetizadores. To start with, the Brigadistas were made up of student brigades and young people. In fact, half of these people were actually still in primary school. This did cause the effect of the early closure of schools. But for most Cubans, this was viewed as an opportunity cost, because although the young people weren't getting educated, the majority of the population were. These Brigadistas travelled the length of the island to the more rural areas, and for some of them it was their first time visiting such places. They usually lived in the home of the people who they taught, and they helped with things like farm work to pay back for accommodation. And it seems strange to think that these young people were teaching older people, because they were motivated by the idea of sacrifice and a better future for the country. And we think in today's world, if that happened, it's just unheard of. And these Brigadistas were given essentials such as hammocks, blankets and teaching manuals. And the teaching involved interaction between young and old, Fidelistas and non-supporters, which prompted a wider change for the country. and also offers them a chance to broaden their horizons. And for the alphabetizadores, as already stated by Jesse, they kind of, although they worked in the rural areas, they also worked in the urban areas and towns. The men and women taught the illiterates close to the home because they had family and work commitments. Okay, now for how were the illiterates actually assessed? So before the assessments, they were given help and the correct resources so that they were able to actually participate in the teaching. For example, Cuba distributed 104,000 pairs of glasses alongside 13,000 eye tests to the illiterates so that they were able to get educated, basically. Venceremos was the basic reading source just to help teach and assess the illiterates, and as an example on the slide, there was 2 million copies issued, and it was a progressive program, so if you pass one stage, you progress to the next, and they would get harder each time. And only the very old population of Cuba refused to learn, as they were considered stuck in their ways, and they weren't really motivated for a better change, more for a change for the younger generation. And now I'm going to discuss the actual results of the campaign and and the numbers involved. So by December 21st, 979,000 literates had been located, with 212,000 people being made literate. Each teacher was delegated with 3 learners, and it was estimated that $73 was spent per illiterate taught. And by the end of the year, illiteracy reduced from 23.6% to 3.9%, and this shows a huge progress that a country made within only 1 year. And of the 1961 budget, 12.3 million pesos of central funds was estimated to have been allocated to the campaign, and this is actually a huge amount of money if you take it into consideration, and showed that they had a huge amount of trust that the campaign would be successful. And I'll pass you to Patrick now.
So now I'm going to talk about what happened after the original campaign. So although everybody was educated to a certain level, there was still a massive gap in between the people who were educated and can do their jobs and those who were already in that field. So the Cuban government decided that they needed to do a scheme following on from this, which meant that they could integrate the people who they just educated into the fields which are most popular in the country, such as agriculture. So they then proposed $9 million of central funds into a scheme which they called Seguimiento. So they took people from grade 1 to 3 and then put them into grades 3 to 6 and offered schemes which are heavily focused on Spanish and mathematics, but also other schemes which would help them in their future endeavours. And this had lower costs than the original school because obviously they were adults and over 14s. So the costs to run these were lower because they didn't need as many hours in the classroom to teach the students, etc. So there was also a proposed Minimo Tecnológico, which was used for people in the fields to train them in the work they do and also with the machines they were using within the fields. So that was proposed, but this was what they came up with, was the Seguimiento. And upon the successes of this, in 1962 they also set some targets. So they wanted to enrol 40% more of people into the scheme. So 17,000 of these people were into new classes, of which 1,000 would be created, and then 19,000 were to be integrated into the existing classes as well. They then also introduced another scheme which they called the Superación Obrera Campesina, which they used as an improvement class. So this again bridged the gap for the people who completed the first 3 primary school grades but then did not reach the 6th grade. So it was again pushing them into certain fields where they could then use their skills and be integrated into the Cuban labour markets. So by the 30th of August 1962, and we'll bear in mind this was only integrated in February of that year, 6,500 people had graduated, and it was hoping that by 1963 this would increase to 30,000 graduates. And numbers of enrolments grew, and although classes in urban areas such as Havana had increased, the actual increase of enrolments was in rural areas, which shows that Cuba had an expansion in rural education, and it shows that previously, obviously, it was a country where it was very urbanized and the educational system didn't really exist throughout the whole country. So it shows that it had integrated throughout the whole country and that Cuba was developing. And then in September, the Third National Congress of Education called for a more increase in enrollments, which would help them to aid 30,000 graduates of people passing. So now we're going to talk about the impact of the educational policies. So the main one is that it shows an increase and a change, as it were, in Cuban priorities. So there's an increase in their priority of education and, as it were, a decrease in military. Because this whole, the timing of this, it was coinciding with the Bay of Pigs, and before Castro took over, they were under the rule of Batista, so they were a very military country. They were sort of defending themselves, and they had sort of outside influences affecting what they did, such as America. And they built, as we can see on the right of a picture here, of an educational complex, which they built instead of a military one, and it shows the shift of focus with Cuba putting education first and including all of their citizens over military. And they used education as a form of defence, again, so they were using education to build up the skills of all their citizens and defend themselves from other countries, but also from immigration, because a lot of the Cuban citizens would emigrate to countries such as America because there were better opportunities. So the whole idea of this scheme was to provide them with the resources and foundations to go into fields within their own country rather than have to feel like they needed to go somewhere else to better themselves for their life, as it were. And it improved the country's economic prosperity, as well as obviously reducing immigration. And finally, it made Cuba self-sufficient. It meant that it could be its own country. It could be rivaling all of the other countries that it was trying to compare to when they started this campaign. And it shows, obviously, with the increase in numbers, it shows the successes that Cuba have had. And where they had got to was significant progress on what they had achieved before. And now I'm going to pass you over to Ryan.
So now I'm going to talk more about the impacts of the campaign. And the main impact was that there was a shift from the elite high culture into popular mass culture of education. Before Castro, it was only meant for the elite people in Cuba, and he wanted to change this so that it became mass popular culture. One example of this is in the Festival Internacional de Nuevo Cine Latinoamericano de La Habana, which the attendance in 2000 was 150,000, and in 2006 this increased to 5.5 million. With all this culture now becoming mass rather than elite, obviously the creative minds of people started to develop, and new genres in film, for example, such as magic realism, were produced. And we see this nowadays in Spain, in films such as Pan's Labyrinth uses them, so that's spread internationally. Poverty and social exclusion was also reduced due to the shift of culture, as more people became educated and able to work. As of 1985 to 1986, there were 14,000 schools and almost 300,000 teachers, which was double of that in 1960, with 11 times as many teachers employed, which again shows the sheer size of the change that Cuba faced from elite to popular culture. In 1979, the expenditure per student was increased to 130, which beforehand in 1959 was only 12 pesos per person, which was again a radical change. As critiques of the campaign, the main one is that achievements were more political rather than pedagogical. It wasn't truly for education, it was still under the influence of the military. And he claims that any state who heavily finances education will do so in order to communicate the values of the state. So they were still trying to have a military influence under the education scheme. This was portrayed by students wearing uniforms and swearing oaths. We also saw earlier in the presentation, Jesse spoke about how tree trunks were carved in the shape of pencils, and how these were used kind of like as weapons to demonstrate the power and the willingness to learn of the whole country. Finally, the other critique we have is the assassination of Comrado Benitez and Manuel Domenech, who were assassinated by the CIA, which still has relevance as obviously Cuba was under control by America for a period of time, and America were trying to prevent the progress of Cuba and the spread of elite culture into the mass culture, and it did this by targeting high profile educational people in Cuba. And so lastly, how does the campaign matter to us and to Cuba? In the current day, the province of Santiago de Cuba has 34 centres of education for youth and for adults, which shows how Cuba is still developing even now. We're still in the revolution of Cuba, and they will continue to develop still. In 1998, UNESCO declared a study of academic achievement for Cuba in Latin America, and this success has reached international levels and recognition. Not only has the country improved the educational system, but as a result, it's developed economically, politically, and socially as well. The campaign can still be used further today to demonstrate how education can be developed further, taking inspiration from the sheer incredible rates from before of how so little people were literate, and they changed radically in almost a year. So thank you for listening, and the last slide will show our references.